The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tina Yeo, a PhD student at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a research assistant at Office of Community College Research and Leadership. I'm working with Dr. Zamani Geller and Dr. Fox in the Hispanic Serving Community College's STEM Pipelines project, which is one of equity-driven change project at OCCRL. I'm also a member of the UIUC Racial Microaggressions research team. So I've been doing research on and providing training or workshops on racial microaggressions. Today, I'm going to provide a webinar addressing racial microaggressions on campus. So there are a lot of information on this slide, so I might not be able to go over every detail, but I wanted to make sure you have enough resources. So we're going to send out the slides and the recording, so you can always go back to the slides or information you want to take a close look. Okay, so maybe some of you might heard or not heard the term racial microaggressions. So for some of you who might not heard racial microaggressions, we definitely go through the definition and types of racial microaggressions. And for some of you who knows or experience racial microaggressions, you can reflect your past experience and think about ways we can address or know how to better address racial microaggressions in the future. So racial microaggressions are seemingly innocuous actions with powerful effects. So we know that there are direct forms of racism and that there are indirect forms of racism. But many of the racial microaggressions that you will see here today will representative as indirect forms of racism, but with powerful effect. So I'd like to briefly talk about where we are in our society before we getting into the racial microaggressions. So when we had the first African-American president, Barack Obama, a lot of people said things like, we no longer have to deal with racism anymore. Race is no longer a problem. You might heard the people saying like this, right? Well, a lot of them saying things like this are actually, well, I think trying to be very well intentioned. What they are trying to point out probably is that we have come a long way since the 1960s civil rights movement. Before 2019, did we even think that we would have a president of color on within the next 10 to 20 years? And yet we were able to elect an African American president. So people say that racism doesn't matter and in the United States, and we live in a colorblind society, believing everyone can make it. However, race affects every aspect of our lives on systemic, institutional, and interpersonal levels. Systematically, we see that race affects everything from educational disparities, unequal employment opportunities, health disparities, and a lot of laws, policies in place that don't have necessarily the best interest of the people of color. At micro level, after the 2016 presidential election, individuals are encountering more frequent overt forms of racism, things like racial bigotry and harassment. More studies, including the Trump Effect report from Southern Poverty Law Center and UIUC, the post-2016 U.S. presidential election report, reported negative impacts of the 2016 presidential election regarding racial climates in school and campus climates. So we have to recognize that racism still affects us in so many different ways and so many different forms. A lot of times people say that racism doesn't exist anymore because they don't see things like overt forms of racism, like lynching and Jim Crow laws. They don't see people being overtly racist. They don't see as much as hate crimes as they did perhaps 30 to 50 years ago. And then they don't participate in these sort of direct racist activities. But maybe we might be consciously or unconsciously participating in things like this or this or this. So although overt expression of racism may have declined, its expressions has morphed into a more contemporary and insidious form that hides in our culture, assumptions, beliefs, values, in policies, and practices. Race scholars believe that racism has become invisible, subtle, and more indirect indirect operating below the level of conscious awareness and continuing to oppress in unseen ways. So when people think about race, they oftentimes think they know what they are supposed to say and what they are not supposed to say on that. But people want to be a good people and good law-abiding citizens. They want to see people as equals. But perhaps they don't realize some of the implicit biases that they might have, which make them participating in racial microaggressions showing in these cartoons. So these are the definition of implicit biases. So in social psychology, for the past years, there has been increasing research on implicit biases, which basically finds that regardless of how good of a person you think you are, that we all hold these unconscious biases about people, particularly people that are different from us. The scientific empirical based study support that. Even though you might think that you don't have these biases against others, you definitely still have these biases, these prejudices that you sometimes don't even recognize are operating in your life. So this is something that we have to think about. We might not be consciously participating in direct racism, but maybe we might be consciously or unconsciously participating in racial microaggressions. Um, the new form of racism, that's what we call the racial microaggressions, are unconscious manifestation of a worldview of inclusion, exclusion, superiority, inferiority regarding race. So, but one of the challenges in addressing racial microaggressions is an environment. People oftentimes will negate that experiences. Most of the time, I observe the people being defensive, saying, "Oh, I'm not like that," or "You are overreacting." "Oh no, I didn't mean to you. So you're not like the others, right?" But given the US race history, the implicit bias and racial stereotypes have been shaped from historical, sociocultural, and political context and activated at interpersonal individual levels. The more you learn racial microaggressions, you'd realize you don't have to be defensive. The first step of addressing racial microaggression is to recognize the implicit bias against the race and racial stereotypes we might unknowingly have, to learn when racial microaggression has occurred and what message it may sending to people of color. So for me, learning racial microaggression is about understanding people who have different racial experience and giving empathy. Okay, so finally, here, the definition of racial microaggressions. So Derek Wing Su is one of the leading scholars on racial microaggressions. So here's the definition. Racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate the hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slight and insult toward the people of color. So there are some key aspects to this definition that really help to convey the notion of a microaggression. First, the messages that they receive are very common. So we know the microaggressions occur in daily life. They are often race-based, but I want you to know that microaggressions, racial microaggressions and microaggressions can also be gender-based and also based upon any other forms of marginality, based on social identity. Racial microaggressions themselves can be intentional or unintentional, but no matter whether they are intentional or unintentional, we know that there is a negative effect, and then the negative effect is hostility, derogatory communication, and racial slight. So here in this slide, I want to show the sub-themes of subgroups of racial microaggressions. So racial microaggressions are manifested in many ways. Put down, the subtle snubs or insult would be conveyed verbally or non-verbally. Or oftentimes, well, people ask to me, "Oh, I said this and that. Is it microaggressions?" But nonverbal expressions like facial expressions or the way you see people or body language tell lots of more stories and deliver more powerful messages. So it's not just only about what you just said, but it's about how you said. So that's why it is important to recognize our implicit bias against people of color and racial stereotypes. So there are many words on the slide. You will see. I just want to show categories and relationships of racial microaggressions, and then we're going to go through one by one with the examples. So here, racial assault, racial invalidations, and then some of the examples of racial insult and racial invalidation. So let's start with the environmental environmental manifest environmental racial microaggressions. So racial microaggressions are manifested on systemic and environmental levels. So examples of racial microaggressions at environmental level are college curriculum and courses where all of the readings, lectures, and content reflect the white Eurocentric perspectives. Or one or a few faculty, staff, student of color on campus. So these are the example of the environmental racial microaggressions. And next, we are going to look at racial insult, the first box. So the racial insult is rude and insensitive actions or comments that insult the person of color. So some of the examples of a racial micro insult would be, I oftentimes use the Joe Biden's comment toward Barack Obama during the 2008 presidential campaign. His comment shows how racial micro assault occur. So if you so look at it here. I mean, you got the first mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and nice looking guy. So if you hear this kind of statement every day, how would you feel? How would you feel? The first, so I mean, okay, am I not articulate? Am I not bright? Am I not clean? Right? So, and then also, this is definitely a description of intelligence. The hidden message would be people of color are generally not as intelligent and not articulate. Something like this message is delivering, right? And also, the second bullet is the quotation from the UIUC racial microaggression research data. And in this quotation actually raised a lot of questions like, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Americanized? What constitutes a real American? So from this kind of daily incident, students of color feel social pressures to behave similarly or to assimilate into white dominant culture. So also the comments like, you shouldn't have to feel offended by it because they are just the jokes, is negating this person's racial experience. And then also another example is that on the bubble, so why are you so quiet? We want to know what you think. Be more verbal. This is also another example of asking, forcing assimilation to dominant culture. And then saying you people is also deliver the hidden message. Okay, so let's go back to, oops, sorry. So we're gonna look at, oops, what happened? I'm sorry. We're gonna look at the racial invalidation. Here, racial invalidation is actions or comments that negate or ostracize the lived reality of a person of color. So racial invalidations, the example is here. So here are the examples of a racial micro invalidation. So why don't you take a look and put yourself in people of color's place and think about what are the hidden messages? What would you feel if you hear such comments? And I will give you maybe 3 seconds to do that because I cannot give a lot of times. Yep. And the hidden messages are this. So when you hear that, well, oh, I'm not a racist. I have several black friends. That would mean, so I'm immune to racism. I'm immune to races because I have a friends of color. But that doesn't mean you would understand, you would know the people of color's racial experiences, right? And then many other examples I want you to look at and take a look at and then reflect and think it through. Take your time to think about this, okay? Oops, sorry. I think I missed yes. And then the another example, the types of racial microaggressions is racial microassault. This is oftentimes happened conscious level. The other micro invalidation, micro insult would happen the unconscious level, but this is pretty much your direct intention to hurt people of color's feeling. So, for example, some of the, your direct use of racial epithets or xenophobic comments like "go back to your country" or "international students" or "immigrants are taking our jobs away." These are the example of a micro assault. Okay. So let me go back to here. So as you can see, due to the unnamed and unmarked nature of racial microaggressions, racial microaggression is very difficult to identify, quantify, and rectify. Even students who experienced these racial microaggressions, they don't know what just happened. When they learned about this kind of concepts, oh, this is what it is about. Yes. So those racial microaggressions are so visible to the minoritized group, but very much invisible to the dominant group. So they are often dismissed or seen as innocent comments, like all the examples as you saw. It's a good, you might did it with a good intention, right? But the the delivered message does not deliver your good intention. So racial microaggressions occur on a regular basis, the daily occurrences. Now, as a result, microaggressions are pervasive, and then the negative effects are accumulated and subtle. They are more dangerous. So research shows that racial microaggressions can lead to health problems psychologically and physically. So these also racial microaggressions create inequities in education, employment, healthcare, housing, all our different dimensions of society. So here are some of feelings and situations that students of color experience racial microaggressions in the classroom. Students of color reported feeling uncomfortable and unwelcomed just walking into or sitting in the classroom, especially if they were the only person of color or one of a few. So and also many of the students of color overheard racist comments between classmates before and after class. And then also in the classroom, students of color also experience racial microaggressions in the lecture content, specifically instructors' inaccurate statement about a particular racial or ethnic group, or outdated terminology, offensive comments, and generalization about an entire racial or ethnic group during a lecture. And students experience racial microaggressions most of the time during class discussion, in small group discussions, and group project. So since now you heard about the situations the students might experience racial microaggressions in the classroom setting, so we can think about how can we make the invisible or the racial microaggressions visible to us. So you can reflect on your classroom or work environment, work practice when you work with the students of color. So here in classroom setting, maybe you can reflect, who do you informally interact with before and after class. And most of it, in the research says, instructors and the professors oftentimes have a more frequent eye contact and interaction with white male students. So you can also think about that. And then also you can also think about who is participating in your classroom. And then you can also ask for volunteers to people of color, to students of color. And then also you can also build on your classroom materials based on students' ideas. You can ask if the race conversation is difficult. So if you don't feel comfortable or not confident, you can also just individually discuss, have a conversation with the students. Then they will help you. And also you can also ask other faculty member to come into your class and give a feedback on lectures. And then also you can also rethink your pedagogy, your classroom materials, and then who are who whom are you inviting as a guest speaker in your class. Okay. And then also the most important thing, as you can see, most of us, considering students experience racial microaggressions most oftentimes in classroom discussions or group project, you can think about the ways you monitor group project. Maybe also you can randomly assign students rather than ask to make their own groups. So here, I'd like to just to share how you can approach, how you can communicate with this regarding race and racial microaggression. So I recommend, the first thing I just recommend is we can check our assumptions and then try to recognize our own implicit biases. I mean, listening to this webinar would be the good first step, to learn racial microaggressions, to recognize your own racial implicit biases. And also, like I said before, you can always have a conversation with the students and then let them know, you're also learning, and then the students always can talk to you if they feel uncomfortable or if they feel something that is offensive. Okay. So I think that's all today, everyone, and then hope this webinar helps you understand the subtle nature of racial microaggressions and how the minoritized group experience racial microaggressions, how they feel. So again, we're going to send out the slides and recording, and then also these are our contact information of Office of Community College Readership and Research and Leadership. If you have any questions or any needs, any help or needs consulting, you can always contact to the Dr. Zamani Gallagher, and also I put my contact information there. And also on March 29th at 2 p.m., we will provide the Gender Microaggressions webinar. So thank you for joining our webinar and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.